This is the third video of the series of theory development in educational leadership. In this series of videos, I'll introduce the major events and theoretical views in each decade of the field of educational leadership. This video is about educational leadership in the 1960s. You can find the rest of the video series in the description section below. Prior to the 1950s, the history of educational leadership was solely American. In the 1960s, UK, Australia, and other Commonwealth countries established educational leadership as a field of study and practice. In 1960s, the launch of two important research journals provided research dissemination outlets for scientific inquiry in educational leadership. Journal of Educational Administration was launched in 1963. Educational Administration Quarterly was launched in 1965. In 1963, Journal of Educational Administration published its first volume. With a focus on international perspectives, JEA has become one of the most prestigious research journals in educational leadership. Its first issue covered the topics of teacher motivation and morale in high schools in Australia, complexity in school system, the role of schools in preservation of arts, and whether seemingly authoritarian Catholic schools could be administered democratically. 2 years later, in 1965, Educational Administration Quarterly published its first volume. Over the years, EAQ has grown into the most prestigious research journal in educational leadership. In its first issue in 1965, the articles covered the topics of intervening variables in organizational behavior, teacher mobility in New York City, as well as faculty rank and tenure policies and the college students' perception of the environment. What's the social context in the United States? In my last video on the theory development of educational leadership in the 1950s, the field of educational leadership seemed to be disconnected from the social context in the United States. Did this disconnection change in the 1960s? In 1963, President John F. Kennedy proposed the Civil Rights Act in his report to the American people on civil rights on June 11, 1963. President Kennedy gave a civil rights address on national television and radio, announcing that he would begin to push for civil rights legislation that would give all Americans the right to be served in facilities which are open to the public, as well as greater protection for the right to vote. 2 months later, over 200,000 people joined the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom on August 28, 1963. The purpose of the march was to advocate for the civil and economic rights of African Americans. At the march, final speaker Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., standing in front of the Lincoln Memorial, delivered his historic I Have a Dream speech, in which he called for an end to racism. Following the March on Washington, civil rights leaders met with President Kennedy and Vice President Lyndon Johnson to discuss civil rights legislation. 5 months after President Kennedy's national address on civil rights, and 3 months after the March on Washington, President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas on November 22, 1963. On July 2, 1964, 1 year after the President Kennedy's national address on civil rights, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was signed into law by President Johnson. among the guests behind him was Martin Luther King Jr. The act outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. It ended unequal application of voter registration requirements and racial segregations in schools, at workplace, and by facilities that served the general public. In 1965, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act was signed into law by President Lyndon Johnson. This legislation was part of President Johnson's effort for greater society and war on poverty. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act has been the most far-reaching federal legislation affecting education ever passed by the United States Congress. It was designed to primarily address education inequity by providing programs and supplemental funding for disadvantaged students. Government spending on Head Start also began in 1965. In 1966, sociologist James Coleman, commissioned by the United States Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, published the Equality of Educational Opportunity Study, also known as the Coleman Study. This report uncovered unequal access to educational opportunities by children of different races, colors, religions, and national origins. Since then, the Coleman Study has become the most cited report by educational leadership researchers. This is the graph I created to illustrate the rise and the fall of topics in articles published in Educational Administration Quarterly. As you can see from the graph, educational leadership researchers have been grappling with the topic on inequities and social justice since the beginning of the field. But the theories that could guide this line of inquiry have been underdeveloped until the 2000s. The history of instructional leadership could be traced to 1967 in an article published in Journal of Educational Administration. The article's author was Edwin Bridges. According to Bridges, the construct of instructional leadership had been frequently discussed in the 1960s, but it was rarely subjected to any rigorous analysis. In Bridges' paper titled Instructional Leadership, a Concept Re-Examined, he examined 4 views of instructional leadership in the 1960s, including the principle as evaluator, helper, integrator, and designer. Bridges also examined the assumption of each view and proposed the principal's role as an experimenter. Edwin Bridges was another influential scholar in the field of educational leadership. Born on January 1, 1934, Bridges was a former principal and a professor of education at Stanford Graduate School of Education. In addition to his scholarship, he also developed the school's Prospective Principals program at Stanford to help future leaders build management and organizational skills. In 2010, the University Council for Educational Administration honored Bridges' lifetime accomplishment by instituting its Edwin Bridges Award to recognize contributions to pre-service preparation as well as continuing professional development aimed at school leaders. A side note here, I was looking for Edwin Bridges' publications on instructional leadership, and I stumbled on his book on Amazon website. The paperback of his book, The Incompetent Teacher, cost almost $1,000 on Amazon. This is probably the most expensive book in educational leadership I have ever seen. Back to the topic of instructional leadership. Even though instructional leadership was proposed at the beginning of the field in the 1960s, it did not gain considerable traction until 2 decades later. In the broad field of leadership, authentic leadership was proposed in the 1960s. But the concept of authenticity can be traced back to ancient Greek philosophy. The Greek aphorism, "Know thyself," was inscribed in the temple of Apollo at Delphi. Socrates argued that an unexamined life is not worth living. The word authenticity has its root in Greek, meaning to have full power and being the master of his or her own domain. The meaning of life does not lie with seeking happiness and pleasure, but pursuing what Aristotle called the higher good, which is one's true calling. In 1966, authentic leaders were considered as those who reduce ambivalence about their leadership role. If you put authenticity in an organizational context, you can judge how authentic an organization is through how much its organizational members resist personal change. An authentic organization, which is led by its leaders, accepts uncertainty, acknowledges guilt and errors, and responsibly participates in the wider community. Since then, the understanding of authentic leadership has evolved to a pattern of leader behaviors that demonstrate being self-aware, process positive and negative ego-relevant information in a balanced fashion, being transparent with close others, and being guided by an internalized moral perspective. Authentic leaders' behaviors were highly correlated with transformational leaders' behaviors. What were the advances in other disciplines in the 1960s? Do you remember Herbert Simon and Alan Turing? I mentioned them in my last 2 videos about the theory development in educational leadership prior to the 1950s and in the 1950s. Simon's research was very interdisciplinary and spanned across the fields of cognitive science, public administration, management, political science, and computer science. In the 1950s, Alan Turing published a paper titled Computing Machinery and Intelligence, which became an influential study of artificial intelligence. In the wake of the first wave of the breakthrough in artificial intelligence research in the 1950s, in 1965, Simon made a very bold prediction that smart machines could be capable of achieving any work a human could do by 1985. In hindsight, that bold prediction did not become a reality. The current artificial intelligence is still considered as a narrow artificial intelligence, which performs a precisely defined task, such as steering a car or identifying an individual with certain patterns in a dataset. This is far from Simon's bold vision of general artificial intelligence, which aims to build a computerized system that is capable of achieving any work that a human could do. In 1969, the Society for Neuroscience was formed. Neuroscience is the study of the development and function of the nervous system. In humans, neuroscience focuses on neural processes, along with cellular, hormonal, and genetic processes, which support the body and the mind. In 2011, a subfield of organizational science emerged. This subfield was organizational neuroscience. It seeks to understand and incorporate the neural processes underlying our thoughts and actions into organizational theory. In 2022, To underscore the cognitive processes, a new term, organizational cognitive neuroscience, was proposed. Organizational cognitive neuroscience is interested in not only the brain's biological system, but also how the biological system, psychological processes, and social stimuli interact with one another and then shape human behavior in organizational contexts. The neuroscience was not introduced to the field of educational leadership until the 2010s. This video is about the theory development in the field of educational leadership in the 1960s. We talk about the two important research journals of educational leadership, JEA and EAQ. We talk about the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965. The history of instructional leadership could be traced to the 1960s. In the broad field of leadership, authentic leadership was proposed. We also talk about the advances in other disciplines in the 1960s, particularly in artificial intelligence and neuroscience. In the next video, I'll talk about the theory development of educational leadership in the 1970s.